And hello once again, my name is Lupus, and I will today be talking about poetry. What is poetry as a genre in literary theory that can be discussed and analysed and understood and all that jazz. I know it's an extremely interesting and fun topic. So we're going to be going over several different concepts such as figurative language, foregrounding techniques, syntactic organization, sound and rhyme, and then rhythm and meter. Just the kind of the basic things that you need to understand when you're doing, starting to analyze and understand poetry and, going into these things in some level of depth. Now, I've made a video before going over the different literary genres in basic terms. So this is the first of those where I'm going to be talking about poetry specifically, and then will be prose, and then after that, drama. So we'll be doing all three of the major literary genres. So, before I get underway, if you found any of these kind of videos that I've made, and I've made quite a lot of these videos over the years, if you find them helpful, useful, what have you, how about you check out some of my books? For instance, I actually have a poetry collection called Forceful Mercies and 99 Other Poems. It has 100 poems, as the name might imply. So if you're interested in that, you can check it out in the description of this video. Otherwise, let's get on to the poetry discussion. So, what is poetry? Well, we have sort of spoken about this in the other video that I did, so if you want to have a more basic overview of what poetry is, you could check that out. Here we're going to just be going into these concepts. So the first one is figurative language. This is one of the major things that defines a lot of poetry, right? It makes use of figurative language. There are various types, so I've listed just a couple of them here. Things like similes and metaphors, personification, symbolism, hyperbole, etc. There's a lot more that I'm not going to be going into, but these are some of the basic ones. Probably one of the most important is, of course, metaphor. Metaphor is the idea that it is a comparison that compares two or more things to one another, but does not use like or as. So simile is, saying he was like an ocean. Right, that's a simile. Whereas if you were to describe an ocean and then using that to describe a person, basically, sort of saying this person is an ocean and then describing the things, their moods change as the time. Well, that's a simile, but you know what I mean. Sort of you could integrate all of these different aspects together to make it an extended metaphor. That is very, very common in poetry. You'll find a lot of poems make use of this kind of metaphor. And metaphor, when you're doing the analysis of poetry at a university level. So if you're doing this at university, you need to be able to understand metaphor. You need to be able to understand these things, to discuss these things. It is very important to be able to do that, right? Metaphor is a basic concept that you will find in just all of it. Metaphor is everywhere. Metaphor is all over poetry. You need to understand metaphor, but understanding metaphor also means understanding a lot of things about the world, and that makes it a little bit more complicated at times, right? Because you have to be like, okay, to understand metaphor, I also need to understand what they're referring to and why they're referring to it and how that is used in the poem. That is a much longer discussion. I should probably maybe do a video at some point although that's semiotics, and I actually have done that, but maybe at some point I'll go more into that. So the other figurative language things are things like personification, right? So that's giving something that is not human characteristics, right? The rock was talking. I don't know, anything. It doesn't really matter. You also get more grammatical ones saying things like the wind whistled, the mountains stared at us, the trees followed us, right? These are all things that are sort of giving human attributes, whistling, following, staring. These are human things, and then giving them to something that is not a human, like a mountain, a tree, whatever. Symbolism kind of often goes along with metaphor a lot of the time, right? Something that represents something else. So think about the basic symbols, like sort of highly symbolic images. Think about something like the Christian cross, right? The Christian cross, it is a cross. It does not mean Christianity. If you knew nothing about Christianity and you just saw a random cross, you would never think to yourself, that represents things from the Bible. If you didn't know what the Bible was, you would never think that. And that's because it's a symbolic representation that has come to mean something in our society, because our society has determined what that thing means. Lots of things are symbolic, right? You can also just show some things that are not entirely symbolic, but have some kind of a representational nature, right? If I show you smoke, it means fire. Now, I have gone actually more in-depth into this when it comes to things like Charles Sanders Peirce's semiotic model, which is a video that is on this channel, and if you want to learn more about that, you can just go and find that. The last of the figurative language things I'll talk about here is hyperbole, which is exaggeration. This video will be 18 hours long. That's an exaggeration, obviously. So hyperbole is exaggeration, but you need to know the word hyperbole and hyperbolic. And I know it is spelled hyperbole, but it's hyperbole and hyperbolic because English hates you. That's something I used to always tell my students whenever they were like, why is it pronounced that way? Because it is. That is the reason. It's very annoying, but that is the reason. It's because English is not one language. It's like 10 different languages mushed into each other, all sharing pronunciations and such. Anyway, so figurative language is a defining characteristic of poetry. Also, foregrounding techniques, which is the next one. A major thing about poetry, right, is that it makes use of defamiliarized language. Now, if you have been doing some of this stuff, literary theory, you might have already encountered Russian formalism, which is a literary theory that talks about defamiliarization. As a quick recap of defamiliarization, defamiliarization is the idea that in literary texts you make language inherently defamiliar. It is no longer made familiar, right? You're doing things with language that you would not do in ordinary communication. When you're just talking to people, you usually don't use rhyme, right? You don't use alliteration. You don't use heavy metaphor. You're saying what you want to say. If you want to say to someone, I'm going to go to the shops, you don't concoct a riddle to say that you're going to the shops. You're not like, my journey today will take me to hitherto seen places that will relinquish the monetary understandings that have accrued between myself and my personal banking system. You're just going to say, I'm going to go to the shops, John. That's what you're going to say. However, in poetry, you can defamiliarize language, which also makes it impractical. People don't speak in rhyme. They don't, because it's impractical. It's a difficult thing to do. Rhyme requires a lot of forward thinking to determine how best to communicate something. And when human beings are just talking to each other, they just say things, right? I'm going to the shop. And then you go, okay. And then I go, do you want anything? And then they go, could you get me a packet of chips, please? And they go, okay. Right, it's practical. Language is often very, very practical. Language is about communicating very, very, efficiently. That's also why the people who conform to a certain idea of linguistics, everyone's heard this before, right? The kids don't speak how they used to. And that's because language changes, and also language becomes more and more efficient over time. There's a reason that we don't speak like we did 500 years ago, and that's because we figured out how to make it more efficient, more effective. It isn't because we're getting dumber, it's because we're becoming more efficient. Anyway, that is not the case with poetry, right? It is trying to basically foreground language. It's not just communicating something. It's trying to communicate something through the use of language in a very, very particular way, often by using multiple meanings, right? When you're telling giving a poem, right, reading a poem doesn't just, not all of them, some do, most poems don't just directly state what they're sort of thinking. Right? Instead, you have to actually sit there for a bit and think about it. What exactly does the poet mean? Or what does the poem mean when it says these things? And that's why you have to sit there with it and actually think about it and say, why is it using language in this way? What is the purpose of language being used in this particular way? Why is it happening that way? Right? That makes sense, doesn't it? To sort of say, well, why is it doing it this particular way? So that is foregrounding techniques, right? So that's defamiliarized and impractical language. Another major aspect of poetry is syntactic organization. Now, syntactic organization refers to the ways in which words and sentences and such are connected to one another in such a way that it presents whatever it's trying to present, right? So a basic thing here is typography. Typography is the specific way in which words and sentences are laid out on a page, right? Now, typography isn't often mentioned unless the typography is kind of weird. Think about those poems where the poem is made to be in the shape of something, like a love poem that's made in the shape of a heart, right? That is inherently breaking the rules of language so that you can put the language in a specific pictorial representation that you like. I want to write a love poem. I want to make the poem look like a heart, so I need to write in such a way that it looks like a heart, which can be a difficult thing to do, right? It can be hard to do that. So that's why the typography is very important. Whenever you look at a poem, you need to look at the typography. A lot of poetry doesn't have particularly complicated typography. It's very simple. It's very much like, here is the stuff, here is the language. But some do have a very important typography, and that messes with the syntactic organization, right? It's not being just written like regular language. Also think about how many poems, for instance, don't use full stops. There's no full stops. There's no commas. Yet, you don't read it as if there were none. You read it as if there were, sometimes. Or it could be that there's lines, right? And the sentences don't end at the end of lines. It might be like there's a sentence for 3 lines, and halfway through that line is a full stop. Why did they do that? Why is it separated in such a way? Why have they done this particular typography, right? That is when it comes to, like, poetry. Poetry does this more than any of the other mediums. Now, some, like prose, does do this. For instance, I remember that a book called Gargantua and Pantagruel by Rabelais, there were some elements in there where it did things like that, where now that's a novel, or a series of novels, very, very old, like pre-Shakespeare. And there are some parts in those books where it will mess with the typography. It'll be like weird, which isn't something you usually see in prose, books and stuff. You usually see it in poetry. So that's like a major thing of syntactic organization. Then, of course, the use of patterns. You get various types of patterns. Like, why are these patterns used? And patterns can be things like the use of rhyme, right? Rhyme is a pattern. Why is it that the end of all of these letters, at the end of each of these lines, has a rhyme? Why are you doing that? Why is the rhyme scheme A, B, B, C, C? Why are you doing that? Why is it in rhyming couplets? What is the point of this particular pattern? And that's not the only type of pattern. There's all sorts of types of patterns. You can also have a pattern where, for instance, you were to say, okay, I am going to do something like repeating the same first few letters, right? Think about like a poem that said something like, if I was alive, if I was this, if I was that, if I was, and that becomes a pattern, right? It's a repetitious, patterns are always repetitious, that's the idea. It is trying to reinforce something through doing it over and over and over and over again. That also works with deviations, right? A deviation is something that goes against what you had expected to happen. So just imagine if you had a poem that goes A, B, A, B, A, B, and then all of a sudden it ends on CC. That is a deviation in terms of the rhyme, right? You're expecting a certain rhyme, and then the rhyme changes. Why does the rhyme change? Why has it deviated from what existed before? Why has it done that? Is there a reason that it has done that? I don't know. Each poem does it for a different reason. So you're going to have to look into that. Subversions are similar, right? A subversion is something that also goes against what you expect. But what a deviation is going like against, a subversion is more like you expected one thing to happen and then something else happened, right? You're watching something and it seems to be like okay, it's good to use an example rather. A fantastic use of subversion is say for instance, a song like The Darkness by Eminem. Right, that particular song, which is a rap song, obviously, as it's Eminem, that song, when you are first listening to it or watching the music video, which is definitely worthwhile, you think that he is talking about himself. And then it turns out that he's actually not. He's using double entendre. He's using, for instance, a lot of imagery and language that is related to weapons, but those weapons can also be related to alcohol. Right, so he'll say something like round after round after round, which of course, a round, you can have a round of shots, or you can have a round of of bullets. Also, he would say, he's taking shots, which of course shots could be doing vodka shots or it could be shooting people. Those are both shots. And these are the things that you can do with language to subvert what an audience is expecting to do something different to what they are expecting. Now, extra patterning is a lastly syntactic organization, things that can be done in poetry, and extra patterning is basically things like rhyme, right? It is something that is heavily going against anything that is normal, right? Extra patterning is patterns, but we can encounter patterns in ordinary communication, right? If someone is continuously saying a certain thing over and over again, that is a pattern. Extra patterning is when you do it like on purpose, like it's really, really going out there to try and be as patterny as possible. So you see, poetry uses these kind of things. So we spoke about figurative language, foregrounding techniques, syntactic organization, so how is it arranged, then also things like sound and rhyme. These are use of melodic elements, right? Things which often, this is why poetry is often very related to music, because it's often using similar ideas to what you would find in music, where you would say, okay, I'm going to hear these certain things like, say, rhyme and rhythm, right? It's saying things in such a way that I might think to myself, oh, this feels like a song, right? This could be a song. If you just had some gentle music in the background, this would be a perfect song, right? Melodic elements are used throughout poetry, right? And these are very important because sound is not just rhyme, but also say things like alliteration and assonance, the repetition of specific sounds. You can do this all over the place. Just look at something like Edgar Allan Poe's The Raven, which is an extremely heavy, like a sound-based poem. It has so much repetition of sounds in it that it sounds really, really good to just hear it over and over again. It's really fantastic in that sense. Okay, so then the last thing we'll talk about here is rhythm and meter. These are very, very commonly found in poetry. Meter, poetic meter, is not the same as a meter in the metrical system. In the metric system, a meter in terms of ordinary communication in most countries other than America is that a meter is a unit of distance, right? You get you can walk 5 meters and 1,000 meters is a kilometer, that kind of thing. That is not what we're talking about here. When we talk about meter, meter is instead the specific beat of a poem. Now, I'm going to be completely honest with you. Completely honest. I suck at meter. I don't know why. I cannot hear meter. I have taught meter. I have written about meter. I understand meter. There is something wrong with my brain. I cannot hear meter. I can't hear the beats. But the way that meter basically works is the use of stressed and unstressed syllables in specific arrangements. So the most common one in English is iambic pentameter, which is an AB. It is a stressed, unstressed, it's unstressed, stressed. You see, now my brain is breaking because it's been a while since I've actually spoken about this. But it's these pairs, right, stressed, unstressed, 5 times for a total of 10 syllables per line. That is that kind of metrical structure. It is a specific repetition based on the stress in each syllable. Now, if you want a much more in-depth discussion of meter, you're going to have to go somewhere else because, as I said, it is a thing that I personally really, really struggle to hear. But that is what meter is in very basic terms, right? And this is where you get into the idea of things like fixed and non-fixed repetitions in poetry. How often is something repeated in a poem? How much does that lead to the way in which it has a specific rhythm, right? And those are important things to look at when you are analyzing a poem. You need to be able to look at these repetitions. Why are they used? Why is this particular metrical structure used? That's also where you get into the idea of scansion. I don't actually know if that's how you pronounce it. I've only ever read this word. But scansion is the specific way in which you identify stressed and unstressed syllables in a poem. I'll put up an image of sort of scansion from a random place where I stole it from, so that you can see what it looks like. Scansion is yeah, you need to basically, if you're going to be doing, poetry, if you're going to be going further into doing analysis of poetry, you need to learn how to do this. Now, of course, I'm not going to lie to you. You should go somewhere else if you want to go into specific scans and how to actually do the proper scanning of a poem and identifying the metrical structure. If you need help with being able to do that, I'm sure there are many YouTube videos that could explain it much better than I ever could. But yeah, so that's why this has basically just been a basic overview of poetry. What is poetry? What are some of the major aspects of poetry that you're going to need to pay attention to if you are going to be analyzing poetry? And yeah, that's pretty much all I have to say about this today. So, yeah. If this was helpful, other than the scansion part, which I do apologize for, I know that's a thing that a lot of people really struggle with. And I understand I was one of those people. I struggled with it and continue to struggle with it. And it doesn't matter that I have like a master's degree now in literary theory. I still am terrible at meter. So, sometimes you got to know your strengths. So anyway, if the rest of this, other than the part about poetic meter, was useful to you, you can perhaps check out some of my books. I've already spoken about one of them, but you can find them in the description. And if that is something that, if you appreciate these many, many videos that I have made, please feel free to check out some of those books. They can be read for free, or you can buy them. I don't personally care either way. So yeah, otherwise, have a great time ahead, and I hope that you figure out how to do poetic meter better than I do.